Picture the moment a scholar's hands tremble as they brush centuries of desert sand from a small clay tablet, and realize, with dawning horror, that the map pressed into its surface depicts a city so precisely planned, so geometrically perfect, that it could not possibly have been drawn by a civilization supposedly in its infancy. The year is 1901. The place is Nippur, a mound of broken earth rising from the flat plains of southern Mesopotamia in what is now modern Iraq. And the object in those shaking hands is about to tear a hole straight through everything Western scholars thought they understood about the origins of human civilization. This is not a story about a map. This is a story about a civilization that, by every rule of historical development, simply should not have existed. The University of Pennsylvania had been sending expeditions to Nippur since 1888, and over the course of several digs, their teams recovered more than 30,000 clay tablets from the ruins. 30,000. More written records than had been found anywhere else on Earth from that era, but it was in the final phase of those early excavations, in the years bracketing 1900 and 1901, that something emerged from the dust that made even the most hardened scholars go quiet. A clay tablet, roughly the size of a hand, etched with precise lines and cuneiform annotations, showing the ancient city of Nippur in extraordinary detail. Canals, temple complexes, city walls with named gates, districts and streets oriented with startling geographic accuracy. And the scholars who examined it slowly realized they were looking at one of the oldest city maps ever found on Earth. A map so sophisticated, so deliberate in its precision, that it implied a level of urban planning, civic organization, and geographic knowledge that history said these people weren't supposed to have. Not yet. Not this early. If you're ready to explore one of the most unsettling archaeological mysteries ever uncovered, you're exactly where you need to be, and you're going to want to stay until the very end. Consider what was already known about Sumer at the time of that discovery. The Sumerian civilization had been essentially unknown to the Western world until the mid-1800s, when British and French archaeologists began pulling artifacts from the ruins of Mesopotamia. Before those excavations, ancient Egypt was considered the cradle of civilization. The oldest empire, the oldest writing, the oldest organized society. But the deeper the archaeologists dug into the Mesopotamian soil, the further back the timeline pushed. And what they found beneath the dust of southern Iraq was staggering. A civilization that predated Egypt's most celebrated dynasties. A civilization with fully developed writing, advanced mathematics, a complex legal system, monumental architecture, agricultural irrigation networks, and a cosmological understanding so detailed it would baffle astronomers centuries later. The question that never fully went away was this: where did it all come from? Here's where it gets strange. Most civilizations develop slowly. You can trace a progression: simple tools, then complex tools, then writing, then cities, then empire. It's gradual. It leaves marks in the archaeological record. But the Sumerians appear in the record almost fully formed. Scholars call it the Sumerian problem, the baffling, unresolved question of how an entire civilization, with all its sophisticated hallmarks, seemed to emerge so rapidly from what was a relatively sparse pre-urban culture. What if the Sumerians didn't develop their knowledge at all? What if it was given to them? And what if the map found at Nippur was only the first thread in a tapestry that, once pulled, unravels everything? To understand why the Nippur map shook the academic world, you need to understand the man who spent years trying to make sense of it, and the controversy that surrounded him until the day he died. Hermann Hilprecht was the epigrapher, the code reader, on the University of Pennsylvania expeditions. Born in Hohenerksleben, Prussia, in 1859, Hilprecht was a formidable linguist with a specialist's command of ancient Semitic languages and cuneiform script. He joined the Nippur project in 1888 and rapidly became the intellectual core of the operation. The man who could look at a fractured clay tablet and tell you not just what it said, but what it meant in the context of a civilization 5,000 years dead. By 1901, he had spent over a decade immersed in the Nippur tablets, and the map discovery fell squarely into his domain. He was the one who confirmed its age. He was the one who identified its landmarks. And he was the one who, in private correspondence recovered decades later, reportedly wrote that the precision of the Nippur map suggested a tradition of cartographic knowledge far exceeding what this civilization should have possessed at this stage. That phrase, far exceeding what this civilization should have possessed, would echo through the next century of Sumerian scholarship like a question no one wanted to answer directly. Hilprecht's career would later collapse under accusations of misappropriating artifacts and falsifying research, which his supporters called a professional assassination, by rivals jealous of his access to the greatest cuneiform archive in the world. His detractors called him a fraud. The truth, as with so many things connected to the Sumerians, has never been fully settled. Could it be that a man with access to the most sensitive Sumerian documents ever recovered was systematically discredited precisely because of what those documents contained? Is it possible that the controversy around Hilprecht was not about ethics at all, but about control of a narrative that powerful institutions were not ready for the public to hear? Let's talk about what the Nippur map actually shows, because the details matter more than the headlines. Pressed into a clay tablet, roughly 21 centimeters wide, as the map depicts the city of Nippur as it existed approximately 1,500 years before the Common Era. But scholars argue the city plan it represents is far older, echoing an urban layout that may date back to the 4th millennium BCE. The map shows the Euphrates River running along the city's western edge. It shows the canal system in careful labeled detail, not just the presence of canals, but their names, their connecting points, their flow directions. It shows the inner city wall and the outer city wall as distinct features, with specific gates labeled by name. The great temple precinct of the god Enlil, called the Ekur, sits at the city's heart, and the map marks it with an orientation and a scale that modern surveyors have verified as remarkably accurate. Remarkably, shockingly accurate for a civilization that was not supposed to have formal surveying techniques. Now here's what they don't tell you in the textbooks. As the mathematical system underpinning that map, the one that allowed ancient Sumerian cartographers to represent distances, angles, and spatial relationships on a flat clay surface, was based on a sexagesimal system, a base 60 number system, not base 10, which we use because we have 10 fingers. Base 60, a system so elegant, so mathematically powerful, that we still use it today without ever questioning where it came from. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. Now 360 degrees in a circle, 6 times 60. The next time you glance at a clock, you are reading Sumerian mathematics. Mathematics that appeared in Mesopotamia, apparently without precursor, around 5,000 years ago. What if that number system was not invented at all? What if it was a legacy, a transmission from a source older than Sumer itself? Some researchers point to an even deeper strangeness in the Sumerian mathematical and astronomical record. Thus, the Sumerians not only tracked the visible planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, with extraordinary precision, but several of their astronomical tablets describe planetary bodies and orbital paths that seem to correspond to the outer planets of our solar system. Uranus was not officially discovered by Western science until 1781. Neptune until 1846, Pluto until 1930. And yet some Sumerian texts appear to reference a complete planetary system, including bodies far beyond the range of the naked eye. How? How does a civilization without telescopes, without spectroscopy, without any of the optical tools we consider essential for deep sky observation, describe the outer solar system with anything approaching accuracy? The official answer is coincidence or misinterpretation. But what if it's neither? Fast forward to 1976. A linguist and researcher named Zecharia Sitchin publishes a book called The 12th Planet. Sitchin had spent decades studying Sumerian cuneiform texts and proposed a reading of those ancient records that the academic establishment met with immediate and furious rejection. His central argument was this: the Sumerian texts were not mythology. They were history. And what that history described was a race of beings called the Anunnaki, a word that translates, depending on the scholar, as those who from heaven came, or princely offspring of the sky, who arrived on Earth approximately 450,000 years ago, genetically engineered early humans to serve as a labor force, and taught them everything they knew: writing, mathematics, agriculture, astronomy, governance. All of it, according to Sitchin's reading of the texts, was handed down from beings who were not human. Now, the mainstream academic response to Sitchin has been consistent and dismissive. Professional Assyriologists have argued that his translations are selective, that he interpolates meanings not supported by the original cuneiform, and that his methodology is not academically sound. That criticism is real and worth acknowledging. But here's what makes the debate more complicated than the mainstream admits. The Anunnaki are not Sitchin's invention. They are real entities described in genuine Sumerian texts. The Anunnaki appear in the Sumerian creation myth, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest flood narratives in human history, written more than 1,000 years before the Book of Genesis. These texts describe beings of enormous power who interact with early humans, who hold counsel in the heavens, who make decisions about human fate with a bureaucratic formality that reads less like mythology and more like administrative record. The question is not whether the Anunnaki were described. The question is what they actually were. Consider this: the Sumerian King List, a document recovered from multiple tablet fragments discovered during excavations in the early 20th century, lists the rulers of Sumer in two distinct categories. Before the flood, it says, kingship descended from heaven. The pre-flood kings ruled for impossibly long periods. One king, En.Men.Lu.Ana, is listed as having ruled for 43,200 years. Another, Dumuzid the shepherd, for 36,000 years. 8 kings in total ruled for a combined period of 241,200 years. Then the text says, the flood swept over the earth, and after the flood, kingship descended from heaven again, but the lifespans returned to human scale. What are we supposed to make of those pre-flood reigns? Is this myth? Is it metaphor? Or is it possible that the Sumerians were recording something literal? Beings who lived on timescales incomprehensible to human experience, and that our default assumption of its mythology is exactly the kind of comfortable dismissal that prevents us from asking the harder question. Here's where it gets truly bizarre. The Nippur map is not the only anomalous piece of geographic knowledge associated with ancient Mesopotamia, or in the collection of tablets recovered from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. Tablets that scholars have dated to the 7th century BCE, but which claim to be copies of much older Sumerian originals. There are texts that describe the world's geography with a precision that seems impossible for the era. There is a tablet now referred to by researchers as the Babylonian World Map, currently housed in the British Museum. It is not merely a symbolic or religious representation of the universe, as early scholars assumed. When you apply modern cartographic analysis to it, it reveals embedded geometric relationships, proportional distances, directional indicators that suggest the cartographer had access to a model of the Earth's surface far more sophisticated than anything the ancient world was supposed to possess. Some researchers have gone further, arguing that the outer regions of the map, labeled as mysterious islands where the sun is not seen, correspond with suspicious accuracy to the polar regions. Not the Mediterranean world, not the known ancient Near East. The poles. Could it be that someone, long before the Sumerians committed this knowledge to clay, had surveyed the entire Earth and passed that survey down through a chain of civilizations we have yet to fully identify? Picture the storage rooms of the British Museum on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Glass cases, amber lit. Now row after row of clay tablets, their surfaces covered in wedge-shaped impressions so small and dense that the naked eye slides past them without comprehension. Somewhere in those rows are tablets that have not been fully translated. Some because there are not enough trained cuneiformists to work through the backlog. Some because the translations are technically challenging. And some, and this is the part that certain researchers find most troubling, because the institutions holding them have not chosen to prioritize their release. What if there are tablets sitting in museum storage right now that contain information capable of reshaping the human story? What if the bureaucratic inertia of academic institutions is, accidentally or deliberately, keeping the most transformative evidence under lock and key? The mystery deepens when you look at the physical Sumerians themselves, or rather, at their own description of themselves. In their texts, the Sumerians refer to themselves as the Sag-Giga, meaning the black-headed people. This self-designation is striking because it implies an awareness of physical distinction. They knew they looked different from someone else. But different from whom? Who were the other people the Sumerians were comparing themselves to? And where did the black-headed people come from? The archaeological record shows that the pre-Sumerian inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia, the Ubaid culture, dating back to approximately 6,500 BCE, had already developed sophisticated pottery, agriculture, and early temples. The Sumerians did not replace the Ubaid. They emerged from or overtook them. But the language the Sumerians spoke, ancient Sumerian, is a linguistic isolate. It bears no proven genetic relationship to any other known language family. Not Semitic, not Indo-European, not Dravidian. It stands completely alone in the human linguistic record, like a tree with no visible roots, which is something that almost never happens with natural language development. Let's step back for a moment and consider the weight of what we're talking about. By the time that clay tablet map was recovered from the ruins of Nippur in the earliest years of the 20th century, many scholars were just beginning to piece together the full scale of what Sumerian civilization had achieved. They had already found the world's oldest written legal code, the Code of Ur-Nammu, predating Hammurabi's famous code by more than 300 years. They had found agricultural treatises, medical texts, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, trade records, and literary works. Now they had found the world's first written story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains a detailed flood narrative, a hero's journey, and philosophical meditations on mortality that read with a depth and humanity that would feel modern if you stripped away the names. And underlying all of this achievement, pressing through every layer of Sumerian culture like a subterranean river, was this one consistent motif? We were taught. We did not develop this alone. It was given to us. The Sumerian concept of the Emi, pronounced May, is one of the most haunting ideas in all of ancient literature. The Emi were divine laws, or perhaps divine technologies, a set of 111 fundamental principles governing civilization. The Sumerians listed them specifically: kingship, the descent into the underworld, musical instruments, the art of the smith, writing, mathematics, understanding, the craft of the scribe, truth, the art of song, the art of illumination. They describe the mi'emi as physical objects, things that could be held, carried, transferred, stolen. Things that were kept in a great repository called the Abzu, ruled by the god Enki. And they described specific events in which the imi were almost lost, almost stolen by rival powers, and had to be recovered. What if the ME were not abstract divine laws at all? What if they were technology? Yes, what if the art of the smith, the craft of the scribe, and the art of illumination described real techniques and real tools, transferred to humanity by beings whose nature we still cannot categorize? What if the Sumerians were not writing myths, but filing reports? There is a scholar whose work sits at the exact intersection of rigorous archaeology and unsettling implication. A man whose reputation survived intact precisely because his methodology was impeccable. Samuel Noah Kramer, who taught at the University of Pennsylvania for decades in the 20th century and whose 1956 book, History Begins at Sumer, remains one of the foundational texts in the field, spent his life translating Sumerian tablets and cataloging their achievements. Kramer was not a conspiracy theorist. He was not an alternative historian. He was a careful, meticulous, peer-reviewed scholar who let the primary sources do the talking. And what those sources told him was that Sumer was responsible for an astonishing list of world firsts. The first schools, the first bicameral Congress, the first historian, the first pharmacopoeia, the first agricultural almanac, the first cosmogony, the first moral codes, the first elegies, the first literary debates. Kramer compiled 27 of these firsts and published them with full scholarly citation. He never claimed the Sumerians had alien teachers, but he also never fully explained where all of those firsts came from so suddenly. No one has. The Sumerian astronomical legacy alone is enough to keep researchers up at night. Cuneiform tablets recovered from ancient Mesopotamia, many of them now catalogued in the British Museum, the Louvre, and the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, contain observations of Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the Moon that are accurate enough to be cross-verified against modern computational astronomy. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, dated to approximately 1700 BCE but believed to be a copy of much older observations, tracks Venus's appearances and disappearances over a 21-year period, with a margin of error that would not be meaningfully improved upon until Galileo's telescope. Nearly 3,400 years later. 3,400 years of no improvement. Think about what that means. Either the ancient Sumerians got inexplicably lucky, or they were using a methodology of observation that we have fundamentally misunderstood, or they had access to information that did not originate with naked eye observation at all. Is it possible that the Sumerian astronomical tables are not the product of original observation, but of transmission? That they copied down what they were told by someone whose methods of sky reading were categorically different from anything we recognize? Now let's go deeper. Because the map is not the only thing recovered from Nippur that defies easy explanation. Among the 30,000-plus tablets hauled out of those Mesopotamian trenches were hundreds classified under a category that early translators labeled simply as technical texts. For decades, the academic focus fell on the literary and legal tablets, the epics, the hymns, the law codes. The technical texts were lower priority, harder to translate, and frankly, less exciting to a Victorian scholarly establishment hungry for ancient poetry. But some researchers argue that those technical texts contain the most explosive material of all. Precise descriptions of processes, measurements, and formulas that appear to describe manufacturing techniques and chemical processes far in advance of what any civilization in 4000 BCE should have commanded. There are texts that appear to describe alloy compositions, And there are texts describing glass-making procedures using controlled temperature processes. There are texts with numerical tables that some researchers have interpreted as describing the acoustic properties of temple chambers, as if someone had engineered those sacred spaces to produce specific resonant frequencies in the human brain. What if the great temples of Sumer were not just religious buildings? What if they were machines? As some researchers believe the Akur temple at Nippur, whose foundations have been partially excavated and whose dimensions appear in several cuneiform texts, was described in ways that suggest not just a place of worship, but a facility with a specific function. The word Akur itself translates as house, which is like a mountain. But certain alternative researchers point out that several associated texts describe the Akur producing a sound like a bull's roar and emitting what the texts call an aura that spread fear across the land. Now, the mainstream interpretation is purely metaphorical. Temple descriptions are always grandiose, always divine, always overblown with religious hyperbole. But what if some of that description is technical? Also, what if a sound like a bull's roar and an aura spreading fear are garbled attempts by Bronze Age scribes to describe low-frequency sound vibration, infrasound, of the kind that modern physics knows can produce feelings of unease, disorientation, and even hallucination in humans exposed to it? Could it be that the Sumerians built their most sacred spaces as resonance chambers, and that the knowledge of how to do that came from the same mysterious source as everything else? Yet here's something that almost never makes it into the popular conversation about Sumer, but that certain archaeologists and linguists have quietly circled for decades. The Sumerians did not claim to have invented their civilization. They claimed to have received it. Their creation myths do not describe a gradual cultural evolution. They describe specific beings, the Anunnaki, coming to Earth, establishing cities, and then deciding to create humans to maintain those cities, while the Anunnaki pursued their own purposes. The tablets are specific about which Anunnaki did what. Enki, the god of wisdom, designed the genetic project. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, carried it out. The resulting beings, humans, were initially sterile by design, kept as a controlled labor force. It was only later, the texts say, through what the tablets describe with almost clinical detachment as a biological modification, yet that humans gained the ability to reproduce independently. This is not vague symbolic mythology. This is a narrative with actors, motivations, technical details, and consequences. And it is written on clay tablets that are 5,000 years old. What if the ancient Sumerians were not writing fiction? What if they were writing documentation, clumsy, filtered, mythologically decorated documentation of events that actually occurred? Picture the excavation site at Nippur as it was in those final years of the 19th century and first years of the 20th. A vast, brutal place where local workers swung pickaxes in 100-degree heat, while European scholars in pith helmets catalogued fragments with trembling excitement. The dust is thick in the air. The smell of baked earth mixes with the sharp mineral scent of ancient clay. And somewhere in the layered debris of a civilization dead for 3,000 years, a worker's pickaxe glances off a flat clay surface, and a map emerges from the darkness for the first time in millennia. The scholar who picks it up does not yet understand what he holds. He knows it is old. He knows it is important. What he does not know is that the lines pressed into that clay are pointing toward a question that his civilization is not yet ready to answer. Let's talk about the connections that certain researchers find most disturbing. Because the Sumerian anomaly does not exist in isolation. It appears to be part of a global pattern, a pattern in which advanced knowledge appears suddenly in multiple ancient civilizations, in forms that are too sophisticated for the developmental stage of those cultures, and in ways that show inexplicable parallels across thousands of miles and thousands of years of supposed separation. The ancient Egyptians had a similar sudden appearance problem. Before the first dynasty of unified Egypt, was around 3100 BCE, there is evidence of relatively modest cultural development. And then, almost overnight in archaeological terms, monumental architecture, a fully developed writing system, complex religious theology, and administrative structures that would sustain one of history's greatest empires. The Indus Valley civilization, centered around the ancient cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, showed evidence of sophisticated urban planning, sewage systems, and standardized weights and measures that appeared with bewildering abruptness around 2600 BCE, and used a writing system that has never been deciphered. To this day, the ancient Olmec of Mesoamerica, the earliest known major civilization in the Americas, appeared in the archaeological record around 1500 BCE with monumental stone carving, calendar systems, and cosmological knowledge that seem to have no clear developmental forerunner in the region. Nay, what connects all of them? Some researchers argue, nothing. Parallel development is possible, even likely, given that all humans share the same basic cognitive architecture. Others believe the connections are too specific, too convergent to be coincidental, that the mathematics, the astronomical systems, the architectural proportions, and the cosmological narratives of these geographically separated ancient cultures share a common root, a common teacher. And here's what makes that theory genuinely difficult to dismiss. The Sumerian texts themselves describe the Anunnaki as a civilization that established operations in multiple regions of the earth simultaneously. Not just Mesopotamia, multiple locations. Specific texts mention the land of the pharaohs, the land of the cedars, and regions that some researchers identify with India and the Americas, though mainstream scholars contest those identifications vigorously. Is it possible that the global synchrony of early civilizational development is not a coincidence or a parallel evolution, but a coordinated seeding? And if so, who was doing the seeding? And why does every institution with access to the primary evidence seem reluctant to ask that question out loud? The mystery deepens when you consider what happened to the Sumerians at the end. Around 2004 BCE, the Sumerian civilization effectively ceased to exist as an independent cultural force. The city of Ur, the great jewel of Sumerian urban culture, the city of Ur-Nammu and his law codes, the city whose ziggurat still rises partially intact from the Iraqi plain today, was sacked by the Elamites from the east. The Sumerian language survived for a while as a liturgical and scholarly tongue, the way Latin survived in medieval Europe. But as a living culture, Sumer was gone, and with it went knowledge. The vast quantities of accumulated knowledge that had been stored in those clay tablets, the technical texts, the astronomical tables, the medical formulas, scattered across collapsed buildings, burned in deliberate fires, buried under conquest debris, or simply lost to the thousand small catastrophes of civilizational collapse. How much was destroyed that we will never recover? How much did survive in copied and filtered forms? He passed down through Babylonian and Assyrian scribes who did not fully understand what they were copying. And here's the question that haunts some researchers most of all. Was the destruction of Sumer accidental, or was it managed? Were there powers, human or otherwise, that had an interest in erasing this particular archive from human memory? Consider what was saved. The Epic of Gilgamesh survived because Babylonian scribes valued it as literature. The astronomical tables survived because later civilizations found them practically useful. The king list survived in fragments. The legal code survived. But the bulk of those 30,000 Nippur tablets, the technical texts, the administrative records, the texts classified in categories that we still have not fully explored, remains partially untranslated, partially dispersed across museum collections on multiple continents, Anu partially locked away in institutional archives that do not hurry themselves. The University of Pennsylvania's Penn Museum holds thousands of the Nippur tablets. The Istanbul Archaeological Museums hold thousands more, a legacy of the Ottoman-era concession arrangements that governed the Nippur excavations. Some tablets are held in private collections, their contents unknown to the academic community. Thus, what if the most important pieces of the Sumerian puzzle are sitting in a temperature-controlled storage room somewhere, classified, uncatalogued, or deliberately obscured, and the people responsible for their translation are either unaware of their significance or aware of it in ways they are not sharing? Here is where the Nippur map itself becomes something more than a cartographic curiosity. Because what some researchers have pointed to with increasing urgency, it is not just what the map shows, but what it implies about the civilization that made it. To draw a map of that accuracy, with those labeled features, with those geometric relationships, you need more than talent. You need a systematic methodology of spatial measurement. You need agreed-upon units of distance. You need the mathematical framework to convert real-world distances into proportional representations on a flat surface. In short, you need an entire discipline, the discipline we call cartography and surveying, to already exist as a structured, teachable body of knowledge. And the existence of that discipline in Sumer, this early, this fully developed, means that it was not invented by the person who drew the Nippur map. It was inherited. Where from? The tablets do not say. Or perhaps they do say, and we have not yet finished reading. Picture that moment again. The clay tablet in the scholar's hands. The late afternoon light catching the wedge-shaped impressions, throwing their shadows into sharp relief. Centuries of desert heat have kept the clay dry and intact, preserved it far better than paper or parchment or wood would have survived. Whoever pressed those lines into wet clay 5,000 years ago, or whoever taught the person who pressed those lines, wanted this information to last. Wanted it to survive, wanted someone someday to pick it up and understand it. Now, what if that's the most chilling thought of all? Not that this knowledge was hidden, but that it was deliberately preserved. That there is a message in this clay that we are only now, finally, beginning to have the tools to read. And that whoever sent it was operating on a timeline so vast that a wait of 5,000 years was, to them, perfectly acceptable. Now, we need to talk about what mainstream archaeology does with all of this. Because the institutional response to the Sumerian anomaly is itself a kind of mystery. Legitimate scholars acknowledge the Sumerian problem. They acknowledge the sudden appearance of the civilization, the linguistic isolation of the Sumerian language, the sophistication of the early astronomical and mathematical record. They publish peer-reviewed papers about these anomalies. And then, in those same papers, they almost invariably conclude with a variation on more evidence is needed before conclusions can be drawn. Which is academically responsible, but it is also, some researchers argue, a way of perpetually deferring the uncomfortable implication without ever having to confront it. The evidence that already exists is extraordinary. The evidence that already exists points towards something that does not fit the standard model of gradual human civilizational development. At what point does more evidence is needed become a mechanism for avoiding a conclusion that the evidence has already forced upon an honest reader? There are those who say the resistance is purely professional, that the academic establishment has an investment in the existing narrative of human development, and that careers are built on that narrative, and that a paradigm shift would be professionally catastrophic for too many people to allow it to happen cleanly. Now, there are those who say the resistance goes higher than academia, that certain governments and certain intelligence agencies have an active interest in keeping the Sumerian revelation contained. because the implications for religious institutions, for political legitimacy, for the entire framework of human self-understanding, are too destabilizing to release. And there are those who say neither of those explanations is necessary, that the resistance is simply the natural conservatism of a discipline trying to maintain its standards against a tide of sensational claims. Each of those explanations is plausible. Each of them is incomplete. And that ambiguity is itself a kind of answer. Think about what would happen if the Sumerian texts were taken at face value. Not through the filter of mythological interpretation, not through the softening lens of metaphor. Just read as documentation. What would the world look like if the Anunnaki were real? What would the world look like if advanced beings arrived on Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago, established settlements, engineered a labor species, and then departed, or were never fully gone? Also, what would the world look like if the sudden fluorescence of human civilization around 5000 BCE was not a spontaneous leap, but an engineered delivery? A download of essential technologies handed to a species that had been specifically prepared to receive them? The answer is, it would look exactly like what we have. It would look like a civilization that arrives fully formed, with no transitional record, speaking a language with no relatives, building cities no one taught them to build, drawing maps no one taught them to read, writing down histories that they describe as memories of a time when gods walked among them. It would look exactly like Sumer. And now here's the thread that certain researchers find most impossible to dismiss. Somewhere in the University of Pennsylvania collection, in a tablet cataloged decades after the main Nippur excavations, now in a lot that spent years in storage before being examined, is a text that some translators have described as appearing to list a set of coordinates. Not geographic coordinates in the modern sense, but a sequence of numbers and directional indicators that, when analyzed by researchers familiar with Sumerian astronomical notation, appear to describe a location not on Earth, a location in space, a planetary position. The mainstream response is that this is an astronomical calculation, actually the kind of tablet-based planetary math that Sumerian scribes produced routinely. But what if it is an address? What if the Sumerians, at the end of their civilization, under the shadow of its collapse, were not writing a calculation, but a memory? A record of where their teachers came from, pressed into clay, preserved against the coming darkness, waiting for someone smart enough to read it? We are left, as we always are with the Sumerians, holding more questions than answers. Now, that clay tablet map, recovered from Nippur in the earliest years of the 20th century, opened a door that scholars, researchers, and independent investigators have been trying to walk through ever since. What lies on the other side of that door depends almost entirely on which set of assumptions you bring with you when you approach it. If you bring the assumption that human civilization is an unassisted achievement, that we climb to our current state entirely on our own, a step by slow, painful step, then the Nippur map is an impressive curiosity, an early example of human ingenuity that we probably underestimate. If you bring the assumption that the primary sources of a civilization deserve to be read as literally as we read any other historical document, then the Nippur map is a piece of evidence in a much larger case, a case for which the full evidence has not yet been assembled and may never be assembled, given how much has been lost, buried, or locked away. What do we actually know? Stripped to its bare essentials, we know a civilization appeared in southern Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago that possessed, from its earliest documented moments, a level of mathematical, astronomical, cartographic, and administrative sophistication that should have taken centuries longer to develop than the archaeological record allows. We know that civilization drew a map of its city with a precision that implies systematic survey methodology, not intuitive sketching. We know that civilization left written records describing the source of their knowledge as beings of a different order, beings they called the Anunnaki, beings who came from somewhere else, beings who made decisions about human development with the detachment of administrators managing a project. We know those records are genuine, cuneiform, dated, housed in reputable institutions, and only partially translated after more than 150 years of effort. And we know that when certain researchers push too hard on those records, the institutional response tends toward dismissal rather than engagement. There are those who will tell you the Sumerians were brilliant humans who built their civilization through the same ingenuity and perseverance that built every other civilization. There are those who will tell you the Anunnaki were real, whether as ancient aliens, as survivors of an earlier advanced civilization, or as entities that defy our current categories entirely, and that the Sumerian texts are the most direct record of that reality we possess. There are those who will tell you the truth lies somewhere in between, that the Sumerian miracle was human achievement accelerated and shaped by encounters we have not yet characterized, compressed by factors we have not yet identified, and documented in a language we have not yet fully decoded. All three positions have evidence behind them. None of them has a complete answer. And the clay tablets keep their secrets in museum cases around the world, waiting in the amber light, patient in the way that only 5,000-year-old objects can be patient. What happened in Nippur? What does that map really show? Was it a document of human achievement, or the calling card of something else entirely? Was the Sumerian civilization the cradle of human progress, built from the ground up by our own remarkable species? Or was it a gift, engineered, delivered, and deliberately preserved in fired clay, so that one day, in a future those ancient scribes could not have pictured, someone would hold it in their hands and finally begin to ask the right questions? The tablets are real. The map is real. The mathematical precision is real. The linguistic isolation is real. The astronomical knowledge is real. The Anunnaki are real, whatever they actually were. Every piece of evidence is sitting in an archive, awaiting to be examined without the filters of convention or the deflecting armor of institutional comfort. The mystery is not that we don't know. The mystery is that we haven't decided, as a civilization, to fully try. What do you think is pressed into that clay? What do you think the people of Sumer were actually trying to tell us? Let me know in the comments below. Because this is exactly the kind of conversation that history needs more of, and your perspective matters more than you know. The Nippur map was found in 1901. More than 120 years have passed. The question it poses has not been answered. Maybe that's the most Sumerian thing of all, that they pressed their knowledge into clay precisely because they knew it would outlast everything else. The buildings fall. The empires end. The languages die. But the clay survives. And somewhere in that clay, pressed 5,000 years ago by hands that understood something about the universe that we are still struggling to articulate, there is an answer that is waiting, quietly, without impatience, for a civilization finally ready to hear it. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again, stay curious.